The morning of August 24th, 1814, dawned hot and humid over the young capital of the United States. In a modest clapboard house along the road to Bladensburg, Maryland, a teenage enslaved boy named Paul Jennings stood beside his mistress, the First Lady Dolly Madison, watching columns of dust rise in the distance. The British were coming. Within hours, the unthinkable would occur. Redcoats would march through the streets of Washington, setting the Capitol ablaze, the flames from the Library of Congress consuming 3,000 volumes in a single inferno. The presidential mansion would burn, its white-painted walls blackened by fire. For the first and only time in American history, a foreign army would occupy and torch the capital of the United States. Yet this moment of catastrophe represented neither the beginning nor the end of a conflict that would reshape the American nation. The War of 1812, often called America's most forgotten conflict, stretched across 3 years, claimed thousands of lives, and determined the fate of an entire continent. It was a war that brought together improbable allies and produced unlikely heroes. It pitted neighbor against neighbor, native peoples against encroaching settlers, and a fledgling republic against the mightiest empire on earth. This is the story of that war, told through the eyes of those who fought it, survived it, and gave their lives in its crucible. It is a story of ambition and humiliation, of courage and cowardice, of promises made and promises broken. And it begins not with the thunder of cannon, but with the crack of a boarding party's boots on the deck of an American merchant ship. To understand why the United States went to war in 1812, one must first understand the precarious position of the young republic in a world dominated by European powers locked in their own titanic struggle. Since 1793, Britain and Napoleonic France had waged a war that engulfed the entire continent, and the neutral United States found itself squeezed between these two giants, its merchant ships caught in the crossfire of economic warfare. By 1807, the situation had become intolerable. Britain's Orders in Council imposed a blockade of Napoleonic Europe, requiring neutral ships to stop at British ports, pay fees, and obtain licenses before trading with French ports. Napoleon responded with his continental system, threatening seizure of any neutral vessel that obeyed British orders. American merchants found themselves in an impossible position, subject to confiscation by one power or the other, regardless of which rules they followed. Between 1807 and 1812, Britain seized approximately 400 American merchant ships. France took its share as well. But it was the practice of impressment that most inflamed American public opinion. The Royal Navy, stretched thin by the demands of the Napoleonic Wars, had expanded from 135 ships and 36,000 seamen in 1793 to 584 ships and 114,000 seamen by 1812. To man this vast fleet, Britain claimed the right to stop neutral vessels and remove any sailor it believed to be a British subject, pressing them into involuntary service on His Majesty's warships. Britain did not recognize naturalized American citizenship. Anyone born a British subject remained British for life under British law. The result was that between 6,000 and 10,000 American sailors were impressed between 1793 and 1812. The United States State Department documented 6,257 specific cases, though the actual number was certainly higher. James R. Durand, a Connecticut-born ship's officer, left a harrowing account of his impressment. He wrote that around 11 o'clock at night, a boat belonging to the frigate Narcissus came alongside his vessel. The British sailors boarded and came below where he was asleep. With much abuse, he recalled, they hauled him out of his bed, not suffering him to put on or take anything except his trousers. In this miserable condition, he was taken aboard their ship, where he would remain for 7 years. The most notorious incident occurred on June 22, 1807, when HMS Leopard intercepted USS Chesapeake just off Norfolk, Virginia. Commander Salisbury Humphreys demanded to search for British deserters. Commodore James Barron refused. The Leopard then fired multiple broadsides into the unprepared American frigate for approximately 10 minutes, killing 3 sailors and wounding 18 others, including Barron himself. The Chesapeake managed to fire only a single shot in return before striking her colors. 4 men were seized from the American vessel. Jenkin Ratford, a British-born deserter, was hanged from the yardarm at Halifax 2 months later. But the other 3 were Americans, including Daniel Martin, a 24-year-old man of color from Westport, Massachusetts, who had been previously pressed into British service and escaped. They were initially sentenced to 500 lashes each, though this sentence was later commuted. The Chesapeake affair electrified the nation. Press coverage of impressment exploded. Newspapers that had mentioned the practice 70 to 80 times per year suddenly printed 738 articles in 1807 alone. By 1812, references to impressment appeared nearly 1,800 times in the American press. President Thomas Jefferson's response to the Chesapeake crisis was the Embargo Act of 1807, passed on December 22nd of that year. Rather than risk war, Jefferson attempted to use economic coercion, banning all American exports to foreign nations and closing United States ports to foreign trade. The result was catastrophic for the American economy. The embargo sent the young nation into a depression. Merchants were ruined. Farmers could not sell their crops. Smuggling flourished, particularly between New England and British North America. The legislation was so unpopular that it damaged Jefferson's legacy and contributed to growing sectional tensions. Jefferson signed the Non-Intercourse Act on March 1, 1809, just 2 days before leaving office. This lifted the embargo from all countries except Britain and France, but proved equally ineffective. Macon's Bill No. 2, passed in May of 1810, rolled back all restrictions while authorizing the president to reinstate the embargo against whichever power continued its restrictions if the other ceased them. Napoleon, ever the opportunist, announced in August 1810 that French decrees had been repealed. This was a lie, but President James Madison prohibited trade with Britain in February 1811 based on Napoleon's false promise. The stage was set for war. Into this volatile atmosphere strode a new generation of politicians, young men from the South and West, who had come of age during the Revolutionary era but had never fought in its battles. These war hawks, as their opponents called them, entered Congress in 1810 and 1811 determined to defend American honor at any cost. Their leader was Henry Clay of Kentucky, elected Speaker of the House in 1811 at the remarkable age of 34, an unprecedented achievement for a freshman congressman. Clay controlled committee appointments, placing fellow war hawks on the Foreign Relations, Naval Ways and Means, and Military Affairs committees. He declared that the militiamen of Kentucky were capable of capturing Upper Canada and Montreal without any assistance. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina served on the Foreign Relations Committee, advocating war to protect American sovereignty and economic independence. He boasted that within 4 weeks of a declaration of war being heard on the frontier, the whole of Upper Canada and a part of Lower Canada would be in American possession. Felix Grundy of Tennessee, known as the greatest defense attorney in his state, spoke for frontier settlers who faced Native American resistance backed by British support. He proclaimed he would rather have war than submit to British insults. His enemies blamed the coming conflict on James Madison, Felix Grundy, and the devil. The Warhawks numbered approximately 60 in the House, and they represented a generational shift in American politics. None had served in Congress before 1800. Most were born during the Revolutionary War. They viewed British actions not merely as violations of neutral rights, but as affronts to the very existence of the American Republic. The Warhawks' concerns extended beyond maritime issues. Along the western frontier, from Ohio to the Great Lakes, Native American resistance to American expansion had intensified, and the Warhawks blamed British influence for this resistance. At the heart of this resistance stood Tecumseh, a Shawnee warrior born around 1768 near present-day Xenia, Ohio. His name meant the shooting star, or celestial panther lying in wait, given for the great meteor that flashed across the sky at his birth. Tecumseh had witnessed the destruction of his people from childhood. His father was killed fighting Virginia militiamen at the Battle of Point Pleasant in 1774. By his early 20s, he had become a distinguished warrior, fighting at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. Tecumseh conceived a vision unprecedented in Native American history, an alliance of all remaining peoples from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico, from the prairies of the Midwest to the swamplands of Florida. His core principle held: that Native Americans owned their lands in common, and no single tribe could cede territory without agreement from all. This directly challenged American land acquisition strategies, which relied on persuading or coercing individual tribes to sign away their territory. Working with his brother Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet, Tecumseh established Prophetstown at the confluence of the Tippecanoe and Wabash Rivers in Indiana in 1808. This multi-tribal community became the spiritual and political center of the Confederacy. In November 1811, while Tecumseh was recruiting allies in the South, Indiana Territorial Governor William Henry Harrison marched 1,000 soldiers to Prophetstown. Before dawn on November 7th, Tenskwatawa's warriors launched a surprise attack on Harrison's encampment. After 2 hours of fierce hand-to-hand combat, the native forces withdrew. Harrison burned the abandoned town the next day. The Battle of Tippecanoe did not destroy Tecumseh's movement, but it convinced most remaining native peoples that their only hope lay with the British. When Americans discovered British arms among the supplies at Prophetstown, public outrage intensified. The war against Britain became inextricably linked with the war against native resistance. Despite the bellicose rhetoric of the warhawks, the United States was woefully unprepared for the conflict they sought. Years of frugal monetary policies under Jefferson and Madison had left the military weakened. The authorized strength of the Army stood at 35,600 men, but actual strength was approximately 11,744 officers and men, including some 5,000 raw recruits. The officer corps was plagued by incompetence. Many were aging Revolutionary War veterans, decades removed from combat. General Winfield Scott, who would later prove one of the war's most capable commanders, observed that officers were ruined by excessive drinking. There were not enough experienced officers and non-commissioned officers, and dependence on state militias was misplaced. The Navy fared somewhat better, though it remained vastly outnumbered. The United States possessed 16 vessels, some sources say 14 ocean-going warships, crewed by over 5,000 well-trained sailors and Marines. But the Royal Navy had approximately 600 warships. 3 of the 5 American super frigates were non-operational at the war's start. The population advantage America held over Canada, approximately 7.2 million to 500,000, should have made conquest simple. Yet this numerical superiority would prove illusory. Many Americans, particularly in New England, opposed the war. The militia system was unreliable, with many militiamen refusing to serve outside their home states or to cross into foreign territory. On June 1, 1812, President James Madison sent his war message to Congress, listing 4 major grievances: impressment, illegal blockades, the orders in council, and British involvement in Indian warfare. He declared that the conduct of the British government presented a series of acts hostile to the United States as an independent and neutral nation, that thousands of American citizens had been torn from their country and from everything dear to them, dragged aboard ships of war of a foreign nation. The debate that followed revealed deep divisions. The House of Representatives voted 79-49 in favor of war on June 4th. The Senate approved by a narrower margin of 19-13 on June 17th. Madison signed the Declaration on June 18, 1812. It was the first time Congress had declared war in the nation's nearly 25-year history, and it remains the closest war vote in American history of any formally declared conflict. The division was strictly partisan. All 98 congressmen who voted for war were Republicans. Not a single Federalist supported the Declaration. About 25% of Republicans either voted against or abstained. In a bitter irony that would haunt the conflict, the British had repealed the hated Orders in Council on June 23rd, just 5 days after Madison signed the Declaration. News took weeks to cross the Atlantic. By the time Americans learned of this concession, blood had already been spilled. Thomas Jefferson had called the acquisition of Canada a mere matter of marching. The reality proved catastrophically different. General William Hull, a 59-year-old Revolutionary War veteran and governor of Michigan Territory, commanded the first American invasion force. He departed Urbana, Ohio on June 15th with over 2,000 men, 3 Ohio militia regiments, and the 300-man 4th Infantry Regiment. War was declared on June 18th, but Hull was not informed until June 24th. Hull arrived at Detroit in early July and crossed the Detroit River to occupy Sandwich, present-day Windsor, on July 12th. He issued a bombastic proclamation calling on Canadians to embrace American liberty. But his confidence quickly evaporated. Opposing Hull was Major General Sir Isaac Brock, the 42-year-old British commander who had arrived in Canada in 1802. Born in Guernsey, in the Channel Islands, Brock was everything Hull was not: energetic, decisive, and beloved by his men. He moved immediately to counter the American invasion. Brock found an invaluable ally in Tecumseh, who had traveled to Fort Malden in July to offer his warriors' services. Brock placed Tecumseh in command of all Native American forces, with the promise that victory would create an independent Indian nation in the Old Northwest under British protection. Brock later described Tecumseh as the most sagacious and gallant warrior he believed to exist. Tecumseh's warriors harried Hull's supply lines with devastating effectiveness. At the Battle of Brownstown on August 5th, Native forces ambushed an American supply column, severing Detroit's connection to Ohio. Hull's anxiety mounted as he imagined thousands of warriors surrounding his position. On August 15th, British bombardment began. 7 American regulars were killed. The next morning, August 16th, facing a smaller British force of approximately 530 indigenous warriors, 300 regulars, 400 militia, and 70 Iroquois allies, Hull surrendered Detroit without a significant fight. Brock had employed masterful psychological warfare, warning Hull that once battle commenced, indigenous forces would be beyond his control. The threat of massacre proved more effective than any artillery. Hull surrendered approximately 2,000 men, 2,500 muskets and bayonets, 500 rifles, 35 artillery pieces, and the armed brig Adams. The surrender shocked the nation. Hull was court-martialed in 1814, convicted of cowardice and neglect of duty, and sentenced to death by firing squad. President Madison commuted the sentence due to Hull's Revolutionary War service, but Hull spent his remaining years attempting to clear his name. He remains the only United States general ever sentenced to death by American court-martial. If the Army's performance brought shame, the Navy provided redemption. On August 19th, 1812, USS Constitution, a 44-gun heavy frigate under Captain Isaac Hull, William Hull's nephew, encountered HMS Guerriere, approximately 400 miles southeast of Halifax. Captain James Richard Dacres of the Guerriere was confident, reportedly offering a challenge to any American frigate. The Guerriere opened fire at approximately 5 o'clock in the afternoon from long range, but the cannonballs fell short or bounced harmlessly off Constitution's thick oak hull. An American sailor, watching British shot deflect from the ship's sides, exclaimed with joy. "Her sides are made of iron," he cried. "See where the shot fell out." The nickname Old Ironsides was born. Hull held his fire until the ships closed to less than pistol shot range, approximately 6 o'clock in the evening. When Constitution's broadside erupted, the effect was devastating. Within 30 minutes of intense fighting, Guerriere's mizzenmast had fallen, the ships had collided twice, and the British frigate's remaining masts collapsed. 7 Americans were killed and 8 wounded. British casualties exceeded 100. Guerriere was so badly damaged that Constitution's crew scuttled and burned her the following day. Hull returned to Boston on August 30th to tumultuous celebration. It was the first major American naval victory of the war. The pattern continued. On October 25th, USS United States under Commodore Stephen Decatur, hero of the Barbary Wars, encountered HMS Macedonian 500 miles south of the Azores. Decatur stayed at long range, where his 24-pound guns outclassed the British 18-pounders. The battle became a methodical destruction of the British vessel, with over 100 round shot eventually lodged in Macedonian's hull. British casualties exceeded 100. American losses totaled only 12. Macedonian became the first British warship brought into an American harbor as a prize, arriving at Newport, Rhode Island on December 4th. On December 29th, Constitution, now under Commodore William Bainbridge, engaged HMS Java off the coast of Brazil. After 3 hours of fighting that left Captain Henry Lambert mortally wounded, Java surrendered, she was too damaged to save and was burned on December 31st. These victories stunned the Royal Navy, which had grown accustomed to dominance at sea. The British Admiralty issued orders that single frigates should not engage American heavy frigates alone. American naval power had announced itself to the world. On the Niagara frontier, the war took a grimmer turn. On October 13, 1812, Major General Stephen Van Rensselaer, a wealthy New York Federalist with no combat experience, launched an assault across the Niagara River at Queenston Heights. The first wave of approximately 1,000 Americans crossed before dawn under heavy British fire. Lieutenant Colonel Solomon Van Rensselaer was wounded 6 times in the initial landing. Captain John Wool led 300 men up the escarpment via a fisherman's path, capturing a British artillery position on the heights. Isaac Brock, awakened by gunfire at Fort George, rode immediately to Queenston. Arriving to find Americans in possession of the heights, he ordered an immediate counterattack. Brock personally led the charge at the head of the 49th Regiment of Foot and York Militia. A shot struck him in the chest. According to one account, he placed his hand on his breast and made no reply, slowly sinking down. Alternative accounts record his last words as, "Push on, brave York volunteers." His aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Colonel John MacDonnell, was mortally wounded in a subsequent charge. British reinforcements under Major General Roger Hale Schiffer arrived from Fort George and Chippewa. Mohawk and other Six Nations warriors under Chief John Norton held the Americans for hours until Schiffer could launch his counterattack. Meanwhile, many New York militia on the American side of the river refused to cross into Canada, citing constitutional limits on their service. Trapped on the heights with dwindling ammunition, the American force surrendered. Approximately 100 were killed, 100 wounded, and 958 captured. Brock's death was a major blow to British morale. He became the hero of Upper Canada, commemorated to this day by a 185-foot monument at Queenston Heights. The battle ended American offensive operations for 1812. The following January brought the worst American defeat of the entire war. Brigadier General James Winchester, second in command to Harrison, disobeyed orders to remain at Maumee Rapids and sent 680 Kentucky militiamen to relieve Frenchtown on the River Raisin, 40 miles southwest of Detroit. On January 18th, the Americans drove out a British garrison and occupied the town. Winchester followed with additional forces, bringing his strength to approximately 900 to 1,000 men, but he failed to post adequate pickets. Colonel Henry Proctor gathered 600 British regulars and militia and 800 indigenous warriors, including forces led by chiefs Roundhead and Walk in the Water. Before dawn on January 22nd, they launched a surprise attack. Winchester was captured in his nightclothes. The American right flank collapsed under artillery bombardment. Kentucky militia on the left held behind a picketed fence until ammunition ran low, then surrendered. What happened next became known as the River Raisin Massacre. Proctor withdrew with approximately 500 prisoners, but left 60 severely wounded Americans in Frenchtown homes. The next morning, indigenous warriors returned. Wounded prisoners who could not walk were killed. Estimates range from 40 to 100 murdered. Some prisoners were taken for ransom. Others were adopted into tribes. The American dead numbered nearly 400 in the battle alone, with over 500 captured. Remember, the Raisin became a rallying cry that echoed across the western frontier. Control of the Great Lakes proved crucial to the war, and by 1813, both sides recognized that whoever commanded Lake Erie would control the Northwest. Master Commandant Oliver Hazard Perry, a 28-year-old Rhode Islander, was appointed to command American naval forces on the lake in March 1813. He supervised the construction of an entire fleet at Erie, Pennsylvania, working through the summer with limited resources and inadequate manpower. By September, Perry commanded 9 vessels mounting 54 guns. His flagship was USS Lawrence, named for his friend Captain James Lawrence, who had been mortally wounded earlier that year aboard USS Chesapeake, crying out, "Don't give up the ship." Perry had that phrase stitched onto a battle flag that flew from Lawrence's masthead. The British squadron under Commander Robert Harriet Barclay an experienced Royal Navy officer who had lost an arm in earlier service, comprised 6 vessels mounting 63 guns. The fleets met near Put-in Bay on September 10, 1813. The battle began at 11:45 in the morning when HMS Detroit fired the first shot. Lawrence took heavy fire for 30 minutes while closing to carronade range. Captain Jesse Duncan Elliott controversially kept USS Niagara out of action, leaving Lawrence to bear the brunt of British firepower for over 2 hours. By 2:30 in the afternoon, Lawrence was a floating wreck. 83 of her 102 crew were killed or wounded. Every starboard gun was disabled, but Perry refused to surrender. He lowered his battle flag, climbed into a small boat with 4 crewmen, and rowed through heavy fire to reach Niagara. Taking command, Perry sailed directly through the British line, firing both broadsides simultaneously. HMS Detroit and Queen Charlotte collided while attempting to maneuver, becoming tangled together. By 3 o'clock, the British vessels surrendered, one by one. It was the first complete capture of a British naval squadron in history. Perry's dispatch to General Harrison, written on the back of an old envelope, became instantly famous. "Dear General," he wrote, "we have met the enemy, and they are ours. 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop. Yours with great respect and esteem, O.H. Perry." American casualties totaled 27 killed and 96 wounded. The victory severed British supply lines to Detroit and Fort Malden, forcing their abandonment. The United States would control Lake Erie for the remainder of the war. Perry's victory enabled Harrison to launch his pursuit of the retreating British. Proctor ordered a withdrawal from Detroit and Amherstburg on September 27th, a decision that infuriated Tecumseh. The Shawnee leader addressed Proctor with barely concealed contempt. "Our fleet has gone out," he said. "We know they have fought. We have heard the great guns, but know nothing of what has happened to our father with one arm. Our ships have gone one way, and we are much astonished to see our father tying up everything and preparing to run the other, without letting his red children know what his intentions are." He compared Proctor to a fat animal that carries its tail upon its back, but when affrighted, drops it between its legs and runs off. Proctor promised to make a stand before reaching Burlington Heights. On October 5, 1813, near Moraviantown on the Thames River in Upper Canada, he kept that promise. Tecumseh reportedly had a premonition of death. He painted his face black before battle and shook hands with each British soldier. His warriors numbered approximately 500, with the British contributing about 450 regulars and a single 6-pounder cannon that had no ammunition. Harrison commanded approximately 3,500 troops, including 1,000 Kentucky Mounted Militia under Colonel Richard Mentor Johnson. The battle was brief and brutal. Harrison ordered Johnson's cavalry to charge the British line, which broke immediately. Proctor and about 250 men fled the battlefield. The rest surrendered. Tecumseh and his warriors made their final stand in a swamp on the right flank. Close, bloody fighting ensued as American reinforcements arrived. Tecumseh was killed during the afternoon fighting. The exact circumstances of his death remain a mystery. Johnson later claimed credit, using it politically for the rest of his career. Rumsey Dumpsey. Colonel Johnson killed Tecumseh became a campaign slogan that helped him win the vice presidency in 1837. Black Hawk, a Sauk leader who fought at the Thames, later stated that Tecumseh's body was not mutilated, that lying near him was a fine-looking Potawatomi warrior decked in plumes and war paint, whom the Americans had mistaken for Tecumseh. That warrior was scalped, and every particle of skin flayed from his body. The death of Tecumseh marked the effective end of organized Native resistance east of the Mississippi River. His confederacy, which had united warriors from more than a dozen nations, shattered overnight. Within 35 years, most Native peoples east of the Mississippi would be forcibly relocated to Indian Territory. 1814 brought a dramatic shift in the war. With Napoleon's defeat and exile in April, Britain could redirect veteran forces from the Peninsular War to North America. 4 brigades of experienced troops were dispatched, along with additional naval vessels. Vice Admiral Alexander Cochrane, newly appointed Commander-in-Chief of the North America and West Indies Station, developed plans to strike at American cities along the Atlantic coast. Rear Admiral George Cockburn, who had commanded the squadron in Chesapeake Bay since 1813, identified Washington, Baltimore, and Philadelphia as vulnerable targets. He wrote to Cochrane in June that within a short period of time, with enough force, they could easily have the American capital at their mercy. On August 19th, British troops began landing at Benedict on the Patuxent River. 4,500 seasoned veterans marched 50 miles overland toward Washington. American defenses were chaotic. Brigadier General William Winder, commanding the 10th Military District, had done little to prepare. The armies met at Bladensburg, Maryland, on August 24th. Despite numerical superiority, with approximately 6,500 men against the British force, American defenses collapsed rapidly. Poorly trained militia faced battle-hardened British veterans who had defeated Napoleon's armies. Congreve rockets screamed overhead, demoralizing the defenders. Within hours, the American line dissolved in what became known as the Bladensburg Races. President Madison and his cabinet narrowly escaped capture, scattering through Maryland and Virginia. Madison spent that night at Caleb Bentley's house in Brookville, Maryland, later called the United States Capitol, for a day. One historian termed Bladensburg the greatest disgrace ever dealt to American arms and the most humiliating episode in American history. At the White House, Dolly Madison refused to leave until the portrait of George Washington was secured. She ordered the frame broken and the canvas removed. She wrote to her sister that she had placed the precious portrait in the hands of two gentlemen of New York for safekeeping. Paul Jennings, then 15 years old, later clarified that doorkeeper Jean-Pierre Ciosat and gardener McGrath took down the painting and sent it off on a wagon. The British entered Washington that evening. General Robert Ross issued strict orders to burn only public buildings. Private property was largely respected. The Capitol burned, including the Library of Congress with its 3,000 volumes. The presidential mansion burned, its white-painted walls blackened. The Treasury and War Office burned. The Washington Navy Yard had already been partially destroyed by Americans to prevent capture. The destruction continued until August 25th, when a violent storm struck the city. Torrential rains extinguished many fires. British forces, exhausted from the 98-degree heat and concerned about American counterattacks, withdrew that evening. 3 weeks later, the British turned their attention to Baltimore, America's third-largest city, a major shipbuilding center, and base for privateers harassing British shipping. This time, they would find a very different reception. Unlike Washington, Baltimore had been preparing for months under Major General Samuel Smith, a capable Maryland militia commander. Fort McHenry had been upgraded with 32-pound cannons. Fortifications rose at Lazaretto Point. Additional batteries lined the Patapsco River banks. Volunteers dug entrenchments east of town. City militia drilled regularly. On September 12th, approximately 4,700 British troops landed at North Point, 12 miles southeast of Baltimore. General Ross rode forward to direct his advancing troops personally. Around 1:30 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, while encountering American skirmishers, he was shot. The ball passed through his right arm into his chest. Baltimore tradition credits two young riflemen from Isquith's sharpshooters, Daniel Wells and Henry McComas, both about 18 years old. Both were killed shortly after supposedly shooting Ross. The general died while being transported to the fleet. His body was preserved in 129 gallons of Jamaican rum and later buried in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Command passed to Colonel Arthur Brooke, who continued the advance but halted after a short, bloody engagement at North Point. American casualties totaled 24 killed, 139 wounded, and 50 captured. British losses approached 350 killed and wounded, including their irreplaceable commander. The naval bombardment of Fort McHenry began at 6 o'clock on the morning of September 13th. It would last 25 hours. British bomb ships hurled 10-inch and 13-inch mortar shells at the fort. Rockets screamed through the air. Major George Armistead commanded approximately 1,000 defenders behind 23 heavy cannons. When British ships advanced to more effective range, American gunners damaged them, forcing a retreat. Diversionary attacks during the night also failed. By 7:30 on the morning of September 14th, the bombardment ceased. The British had failed. Watching the bombardment from a true ship 8 miles distant was Francis Scott Key, a 35-year-old Georgetown lawyer who had come to negotiate the release of a civilian prisoner. Through the night, Key watched the rocket's red glare and the bombs bursting in air, illuminating the storm flag that flew over Fort McHenry. At dawn on September 14th, the smaller storm flag was lowered and the garrison flag rose over the fort. This enormous banner, 30 feet by 42 feet with 15 stars and 15 stripes, had been sewn by Baltimore flagmaker Mary Pickersgill. Major Armistead had wanted a flag so large that the British would have no difficulty seeing it from a distance. The flag cost $405.90. Key began composing a poem he called Defense of Fort McHenry, setting it to the tune of a British drinking song, To Anacreon in Heaven. First printed as a broadside on September 15th, it would eventually become known as the Star-Spangled Banner. Congress made it the national anthem in 1931. While Baltimore withstood the British assault, another crucial battle unfolded to the north. Lieutenant General Sir George Prevost led approximately 10,000 to 14,000 veteran troops south along the Lake Champlain-Hudson River corridor, a potential invasion route from Canada to New York City. Opposing him was Brigadier General Alexander Macomb with only 1,500 regulars and 2,500 to 3,000 militia. But on the lake, Master Commandant Thomas MacDonough commanded a squadron anchored inside Plattsburgh Bay. MacDonough, 31 years old, had prepared carefully. He positioned his ships at anchor, laid special spring anchors so his vessels could be rotated to bring fresh broadsides to bear, and forced the British squadron to sail around Cumberland Head Peninsula into unfavorable position. The naval battle on September 11th began shortly after dawn. British Captain George Downey was killed early, crushed by a cannon. After several hours of intense fighting, when starboard batteries on USS Saratoga and USS Eagle were damaged, MacDonough used his spring anchors to swing the ships, bringing port guns to bear. The maneuver was executed flawlessly. HMS Confiance struck her colors. Other British vessels followed. All 4 major British ships were captured. British naval historian William Laird Clowes called it a most notable feat, one which, on the whole, surpassed that of any other captain of either navy in this war. When Prevost learned of the naval defeat, he called off his ground assault despite outnumbering American defenders significantly. His subordinates, Peninsular War veterans, protested furiously, but Prevost ordered retreat to Canada. Without naval control of the lake, he reasoned, his army could not be supplied. The American victory at Plattsburgh, combined with Baltimore, denied Britain territorial leverage at the peace negotiations in Ghent. In the South, a separate but interconnected conflict raged. The Creek Nation had divided between the Red Sticks, nativists who opposed American expansion and sought to preserve traditional ways, and the Lower Creek, who maintained closer relationships with American authorities. Tecumseh had visited Creek towns in the fall of 1811, and his message had inspired the Red Stick faction. By 1813, civil war engulfed the Creek Nation. On August 30th, 1813, approximately 700 to 1,000 Red Stick warriors attacked Fort Mims, north of Mobile. The fort contained between 400 and 517 people, settlers, mixed-blood Creek, militia, and enslaved people. Commander Major Daniel Beasley had dismissed warnings of the attack. The gate was blocked open by drifting sand. The attack began at midday. After 4 hours of desperate fighting, the Red Sticks set buildings ablaze with burning arrows. Between 250 and 400 defenders were killed. Approximately 100 were taken captive. The rallying cry, "Remember Fort Mims," echoed across the frontier. Tennessee Governor Willie Blount appointed Andrew Jackson, commander of the Tennessee militia, to lead the counterattack. Jackson assembled approximately 5,000 men, including 500 to 600 Cherokee allies and Lower Creek warriors who had chosen the American side. The campaign culminated on March 27, 1814, at Horseshoe Bend on the Tallapoosa River in central Alabama. Approximately 1,000 Red Stick warriors under Chief Manawa had fortified a village behind a massive log and dirt barricade. Jackson's 2 cannon bombarded the position for 2 hours with limited effect. Cherokee warriors swam the river, seized red stick canoes, and attacked from the rear. Jackson then ordered a bayonet charge. Among the first Americans over the barricade was a young ensign named Sam Houston, who would later lead the Texas Revolution. Houston was wounded by a Creek arrow, but continued fighting. The battle lasted over 5 hours. The Red Sticks refused to surrender. Approximately 800 were killed, roughly 550 on the battlefield, and 300 in the river. It was the deadliest single day for Native Americans in recorded North American history. American casualties totaled 49 killed and approximately 154 wounded. The Treaty of Fort Jackson, signed on August 9, 1814, forced the Creek Nation to cede 23 million acres, half of central Alabama and part of southern Georgia. Cruelly, Jackson forced this cession, even from Lower Creek, who had been American allies, and seized nearly 2 million acres claimed by the Cherokee, who had also fought alongside the Americans. The summer of 1814 saw the most professional fighting of the war on the Niagara frontier. Major General Jacob Brown commanded an American force that had been drilled relentlessly by Brigadier General Winfield Scott, who would later command American forces in the Mexican-American War and remain a general into the Civil War. On July 5th, at the Battle of Chippewa, Scott's brigade faced British regulars in open field. Major General Phineas Ryle reportedly exclaimed upon seeing the well-drilled Americans advance, "Those are regulars, by God!" For the first time in the war, trained American soldiers had matched British quality in stand-up battle. 20 days later came the bloodiest battle of the entire conflict. On July 25th, the armies clashed at Lundy's Lane, near Niagara Falls. 6 hours of fighting continued into darkness, with musket flashes providing the only light. Both commanding generals were seriously wounded. Winfield Scott was hit so badly he required evacuation. Friendly fire incidents plagued both sides due to darkness and smoke. Casualties were staggering. American losses approached 850, with 174 killed. British casualties exceeded 870. Total combined casualties approached 1,730, making it one of the deadliest battles ever fought on Canadian soil. The result was a tactical draw but strategic British victory. The Americans withdrew to Fort Erie, ending any hope of conquering Upper Canada. The siege of Fort Erie continued through August, with a major British night assault on August 15th repulsed when a magazine exploded. American forces eventually withdrew across the Niagara River on November 5, 1814, ending the invasion of Canada forever. Peace negotiations had begun in the neutral city of Ghent in August 1814. 5 American commissioners, led by John Quincy Adams, and including Henry Clay, Albert Gallatin, James Bayard, and Jonathan Russell, faced 3 British negotiators, Admiral Lord Gambier, Admiralty lawyer William Adams, and Under-Secretary for War and Colonies Henry Goulburn. The British initially demanded extensive concessions: creation of a protected Native American buffer state in the Northwest Territory, demilitarization of the Great Lakes, Canadian border adjustments including territory in Maine and Minnesota, navigation rights on the Mississippi, and acknowledgement of British maritime rights, including impressment. The Americans refused categorically. Goulburn remarked that he had, till he came to Ghent, had no idea of the fixed determination which prevailed in American breasts regarding refusal to create an Indian buffer state. As negotiations dragged on, news of American victories at Baltimore and Plattsburgh weakened the British position. Britain had been fighting the Napoleonic Wars for over 2 decades. The treasury was strained. British merchants wanted resumed trade with America. Lord Liverpool's government concluded that further territorial gains were not worth the cost. By October, British demands had moderated substantially. By December, both sides agreed to what amounted to status quo, antebellum, restoration of pre-war conditions. The treaty said nothing about impressment or neutral trading rights, the ostensible causes of the war. It merely ended hostilities and established commissions to settle remaining border disputes. The Treaty of Ghent was signed on Christmas Eve, December 24, 1814. Britain ratified it on December 30th. The American copy was rushed across the Atlantic, arriving in Washington in early February. the United States Senate ratified the treaty unanimously on February 16, 1815. President Madison and the British ambassador exchanged ratified copies on February 17, officially ending the war. But the war's greatest battle occurred before anyone in America knew peace had been signed. Andrew Jackson arrived in New Orleans on December 1, 1814. He found a city in chaos, threatened by the largest British expeditionary force ever sent to North America. Approximately 8,000 to 10,000 veteran troops had gathered, commanded by Major General Sir Edward Pakenham, brother-in-law of the Duke of Wellington. Jackson declared martial law, requiring every weapon and able-bodied man to defend the city. He assembled the most diverse American army ever to take the field: regular United States Army troops, Marines, sailors, Tennessee and Kentucky militia, Louisiana militia, New Orleans businessmen, the Battalion of Free Men of Color, Choctaw warriors, and, most improbably, the pirates of Barataria Bay. Jean Lafitte, a French privateer who operated from Barataria Bay south of New Orleans, had been approached by British officers in September 1814. They offered him $30,000, a captain's commission in the Royal Navy, amnesty, and land in exchange for helping capture New Orleans. Instead, Lafitte forwarded their letters to the Louisiana governor, offering to defend America. Jackson initially called the Baratarians hellish banditti, but he recognized their value. They were the best gunners in the Caribbean and knew the terrain around New Orleans intimately. Approximately 50 Baratarians manned guns on American battleships and land batteries. Jackson established his main defensive position along the Rodriguez Canal at Chalmette Plantation, a 1-mile line between the Mississippi River and a cypress swamp. Breastworks of logs, earth, and cotton bales coated with mud rose behind the canal. Preliminary actions on December 23 and January 1 demonstrated British vulnerability. Jackson's surprise night attack on December 23 stalled the British advance. Their artillery bombardment on New Year's Day failed to breach American lines. On January 8, 1815, Pakenham ordered the main assault before sunrise. Approximately 8,000 British troops advanced in frontal assault against American positions. The 44th Regiment of Foot had been assigned to carry fascines and ladders for crossing the canal and scaling ramparts, but arrived without them, leaving assault troops stranded under devastating fire. American artillery tore great gaps in the advancing ranks. Tennessee and Kentucky riflemen, firing from behind breastworks, cut down wave after wave of attackers. Major General Samuel Gibbs was mortally wounded leading his column. Pakenham himself rode forward to rally his shattered troops. He was hit by an American volley and died of his wounds later that day. The battle lasted less than 30 minutes for the main assault, with mopping up continuing for another hour or two. A Kentucky soldier later wrote that when the smoke had cleared and they could obtain a fair view of the field, it looked at first glance like a sea of blood. British casualties approached 2,000 to 2,500, with approximately 700 killed. Of 3,000 men under Gibbs and Major General John Keane, 2,000 became casualties in under 30 minutes. American casualties were minimal, with most sources citing 13 killed and 39 wounded. It was the greatest American land victory of the war. News of New Orleans reached Washington within days of the treaty's ratification. The timing created an enduring mythology, the impression that Jackson's victory had won the war, though in fact the peace had already been signed. Among those who survived the bloodiest fighting was a boy named Jarvis Frary Hanks, born in Pittsford, New York in 1799. He enlisted at age 14 as a drummer in the 11th United States Infantry, enticed by promises of $20 bounty and 160 acres of land. Hanks fought at Chippewa and Lundy's Lane. At the latter battle, he nearly died. He later recalled sitting on a fence for a single instant, ready to jump off into the open lot, when a charge of grape shot rattled around him with terrible threatening to his person. 1,000 times, he wrote. He reflected on this incident as the most wonderful providential preservation from instant death. His memoir captured the grim reality of the soldier's life. He described his first time sleeping on anything harder than feathers and eating any kind of meat unless it was previously well cooked. He watched soldiers eat raw pork with greediness, Morale was so low that many deserted, facing brutal punishment, running the gauntlet, followed by 5 years hard labor. As an artist, Hanks drew fortification plans and battle maps using watercolors. He was honorably discharged in 1815, his commander noting he had faithfully performed all the duties of an excellent drummer and soldier. He later became a noted artist in Cleveland, Ohio, and a strong abolitionist who served as secretary of the Cleveland Anti-Slavery Society. Far from the battlefields, another drama unfolded at Dartmoor Prison in Devon, England. Approximately 6,500 American prisoners were held there during the war, including nearly 1,000 African American sailors. When white American prisoners petitioned for segregation, the black prisoners were moved to prison number 4. There, a remarkable figure emerged. Richard Crafis, known as King Dick, was approximately 6 feet 3 inches tall, stout, with a round face. He had been captured as a privateer near Bordeaux in March 1814. Crafis quickly became the elected leader of the black prisoners. Wearing a bearskin grenadier's cap as symbol of authority, he ruled with absolute power. One white inmate wrote that his word was supreme, that no higher authority could be appealed to than his. Under King Dick's rule, number 4 became the best-run block in the prison. It had its own courts, market, theater that performed Shakespeare including Othello and Romeo and Juliet, gambling room, boxing school, and Methodist preacher. Another diarist noted that many of the most respectable prisoners preferred to mess in number 4 on account of its superior order. Even after the Treaty of Ghent was signed, American prisoners remained trapped at Dartmoor for months. On April 6, 1815, tensions exploded. Guards fired into prisoners. 7 Americans were killed and 31 wounded. Survivors described British soldiers as murderous, acting with cool and deliberate malice. Men lay bleeding and groaning in their hammocks, too afraid to cross the yard to the hospital. Prisoner Nathaniel Pierce wrote in his journal, "Never, so help me God, will I make peace with the English until I revenge the blood of my countrymen." Charles Ball, born around 1781 in Calvert County, Maryland, had escaped from a Georgia plantation before the war. Declaring himself a free man, he enlisted in Commodore Joshua Barney's Chesapeake Bay flotilla rather than accepting British offers of freedom. Ball served as a seaman and cook. He tried to convince other escaped slaves to stay in America rather than fleeing to British ships. He went among them, he wrote, and talked to them a long time on the subject of returning home, but found that their heads were full of notions of liberty and happiness in some of the West India Islands. At the Battle of Bladensburg, Ball manned a cannon beside Commodore Barney. His memoir describes the American defeat. He stood at his gun until the Commodore was shot down when Barney ordered the retreat. If the militia regiments that lay upon their right and left could have been brought to charge the British in close fight as they crossed the bridge, Ball believed, they would have killed or taken the whole of them in a short time. But the militia ran like sheep chased by dogs. Ball's story did not end with the war. In 1830, he was tracked down by his former Georgia enslavers agent, kidnapped from his farm, and taken south in chains. He passed through Bladensburg on his journey to bondage. On the evening of the second day, he wrote, "They halted at Bladensburg, and he found himself within full view of the very ground where 16 years before he had fought in the ranks of the Army of the United States. In defense of the liberty and independence of that which he then regarded as his country, he escaped again, only to find his wife and children had been kidnapped and sold, his farm seized by a white man." Ball is depicted on the Battle of Bladensburg monument in Maryland. As many historians have pointed out, with the War of 1812 ending in a draw, the conflict's only real losers were the American Indians. The Treaty of Ghent contained a weak provision, Article 9, calling for restoration of Native American lands and status to their 1811 boundaries. This promise was soon broken by continued American expansion. The British had promised Tecumseh an independent Indian nation. At Ghent, they initially demanded creation of a protected indigenous state in the Northwest Territory. When American negotiators flatly refused, Britain abandoned the demand. The Native coalition had already disintegrated after Tecumseh's death. Without the support of their British allies, Native peoples were left vulnerable to United States power and expansionism. Within a generation, the Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by President Andrew Jackson, the hero of Horseshoe Bend and New Orleans, authorized the forced relocation of native nations from their ancestral lands. The Trail of Tears followed, with the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole marched west to Indian Territory. Thousands died. October 5th, the anniversary of Tecumseh's death, became a very important date in Native history. As a result of his defeat, Native peoples were never again considered separate and equal partners in international relations. The Federalist Party became the biggest American casualty of the war. Their opposition to the conflict, concentrated in trade-dependent New England, had been viewed as unpatriotic by Republicans. The Hartford Convention, held from December 15, 1814 to January 5, 1815, proved disastrous. 26 Federalist delegates from New England states met secretly to discuss grievances about the war and trade embargo. Some delegates considered secession from the Union. By the time their emissaries arrived in Washington with proposed constitutional amendments, news of New Orleans' victory and the Treaty of Ghent had arrived. The Federalists appeared reactionary, short-sighted, and disloyal. The party lost the 1816 presidential election. It effectively ceased to exist by the 1820s. Former Federalists migrated to Republican and Whig parties. American politics entered the era of good feelings, a decade of reduced partisan rancor with the Democratic-Republican Party achieving near-complete dominance. The war reshaped the American economy. British blockade during the conflict had created severe shortages, spurring domestic manufacturing. The cotton manufacturing industry began at Waltham, Massachusetts, where Francis Cabot Lowell established his famous mills. Post-war tariffs protected these new industries from British competition. The American system, championed by Henry Clay, called for protective tariffs to shield domestic manufacturing, a national bank to stabilize currency and credit, and federally funded internal improvements, including roads and canals. The Second Bank of the United States was chartered in 1816. The Erie Canal, its construction spurred by wartime concerns about transportation, would transform American commerce. Total American military expenditures during the war reached approximately $93 million. The federal government borrowed $80 million to finance the conflict. But the post-war period brought dramatic economic growth, decreased prices, and strengthening of the dollar. The Treaty of Ghent established the framework for peaceful resolution of remaining disputes. The Rush-Bagot Agreement, signed on April 28 and 29, 1817, limited naval armaments on the Great Lakes and Lake Champlain. Each country was allowed a maximum of 1 vessel on Lake Champlain, 1 on Lake Ontario, and 2 on the Upper Great Lakes, each limited to 100 tons and 1 18-pound cannon. This agreement created the foundation for what would become the world's longest demilitarized border, stretching 5,525 miles. The Convention of 1818 set the boundary from Angle Inlet south to the 49th parallel, then due west to the Rocky Mountains, and established joint United States and British control of Oregon Territory. Border issues would not be fully resolved until the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842 settled the Maine-New Brunswick boundary, and the Oregon Treaty of 1846 fixed the northwestern border at the 49th parallel. The war is remembered very differently depending on which side of the border one stands. In Canada, the War of 1812 is considered a victory, the moment when French and English Canadians first united against a common threat. Canada remained British and eventually developed its own national identity, partly from pride over repulsing American invasions. Heroes emerged who remain household names: Isaac Brock, Laura Secord, who warned British forces of an American attack, enabling victory at Beaver Dams, and Tecumseh, adopted as a Canadian hero despite being Shawnee. Canadian schools teach the war for 3 to 4 weeks. The Canadian government spent over $28 million on bicentennial commemorations between 2012 and 2015. Many Canadians consider that they won the war because they are not American. In the United States, the War of 1812 is the forgotten war, the Rodney Dangerfield of conflicts that doesn't get respect. American schools cover it in a couple of days at most. Few Americans remember details beyond the Star-Spangled Banner. No National Bicentennial Commission was created. Americans have found a way of both forgetting and remembering various bits and pieces of the war. The victory at New Orleans is remembered. The burning of Washington is generally forgotten. The naval victories are celebrated. The surrender of Detroit is ignored. Historians continue to debate the war's significance and outcome. Some view it as an American victory, pointing to the successful defense of sovereignty, the assertion of national identity, and the mythology of the Second War of Independence. Others view it as a draw, noting that the Treaty of Ghent restored status quo ante bellum, with neither side achieving its war aims. Still others consider it a British victory, emphasizing the successful defense of Canada and the complete failure of American invasions. Donald Hickey's seminal study, The War of 1812, a forgotten conflict, brought renewed scholarly attention to the war. Alan Taylor's The Civil War of 1812 emphasized the divided loyalties that characterized the conflict, with Americans fighting Americans and Canadians fighting Canadians alongside the broader national struggle. Modern scholarship gives increasing attention to Native American and Canadian perspectives, moving beyond the traditional American-centered narrative. The war is now understood as a complex, multi-sided conflict with no clear winners and very clear losers. The War of 1812 was, in the words of one historian, one of those episodes in history that make everybody happy because everybody interprets it in his own way. Americans remember naval victories and the defense of Baltimore. Canadians remember the repulsion of invasion and the birth of national identity. Native peoples remember betrayal and catastrophic loss. The British, preoccupied with their struggle against Napoleon, barely remember it at all. Yet the war's consequences shaped the continent for generations. It accelerated American expansion westward, ended effective native resistance east of the Mississippi, established the world's longest peaceful border, and launched the careers of political leaders who would dominate American life for decades. Andrew Jackson rode his fame to the presidency. William Henry Harrison campaigned on Tippecanoe and Tyler, too. The naval tradition of Stephen Decatur and Oliver Hazard Perry established foundations for American maritime power. The Star-Spangled Banner, born in the smoke of Fort McHenry's bombardment, became the national anthem. Uncle Sam, possibly born in a meat packer's stamp on barrels of Army beef, became the national symbol. American nationalism, forged in the fire of Washington's burning and New Orleans's triumph, entered its adolescence. Perhaps most importantly, the war demonstrated that the American experiment would endure. Despite military disasters, internal divisions, and the humiliation of watching their capital burn, Americans had defended their sovereignty against the world's greatest military power. The Republic, barely 3 decades old, had survived its second war with Britain. There would be no third. Today, the War of 1812 remains America's most forgotten conflict, overshadowed by the revolution that preceded it and the Civil War that followed. But for those who fought it, for the sailors impressed into British service, for the militiamen who fled at Bladensburg and the Kentuckians who held at New Orleans, for Tecumseh dying in a swamp and Dolly Madison fleeing with Washington's portrait, for drummers like Jarvis Hanks and prisoners like King Dick and veterans like Charles Ball, it was anything but forgotten. It was the crucible that shaped their lives and their nation. In the smoke of burning capitals and the thunder of naval guns, in the diplomats' negotiations at Ghent and the dying dreams of a pan-Indian confederacy, they lived through history that would echo across centuries. We remember them now, 200 years later, and in remembering, we reclaim the forgotten fire that forged a continent.